Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. This morning we're going to look at Matthew chapter 9 and what's going on there. There's some more healings. There is a tax collector that's called. It's kind of funny because we have a tax collector in our midst. He might learn something today. That was a joke. This morning we're going to look at Matthew in chapter 9. And it's really good to have everyone here this morning. So we think about, chapter 9 is sort of bringing to a close this section of chapter 5, 6, and 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount, and then 7 or 8 and 9, which is putting the Sermon on the Mount into action. And we can see that on any given day here, that Jesus would hear, that we would hear Jesus announcing the nearness that the kingdom of God is arriving in himself, and that the kingdom was here in himself and in what he was doing and saying. And so this is what Matthew has really, really deeply explored for the past 4 chapters, right? Jesus has not only used word pictures in his Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7, but he's now drawn a more clear picture of what it means to be his disciple and what it means to enter into life in the kingdom of heaven. And he's done that by his actions. He's drawn that picture by his actions. And so Matthew is now presented here, by the time we get done with chapter 9, he's presented this parallel collection of stories of Jesus' actions, of his miraculous actions in the area of Galilee. And so we have the north end of the lake, and then he crosses over to the other side of the eastern side of the lake, and then he crosses back. And so Matthew has presented these stories as the actions of the kingdom of heaven. And then in chapter 10, we're going to introduce sort of another lesson that Jesus is going to give. And this time it's going to be specifically to the 12 and what it means to be a disciple of his. And so this collection of stories and narrative elements here provides a basis for the claim in chapter 11 and verse 2 through 6. Let me just turn there real quick. And let's read that first, because what's happening now is the basis for his claim in chapters 11 and verse 1 through 6. When Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, that's chapter 10, that'll be next week, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities. Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of Christ, he sent words by the disciples, and he said, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another?" And Jesus answered him, "Go and tell what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." What we see happening in chapters 8 and 9 is the very basis of Christ's claim to being the Messiah. That's what he says. Because he doesn't answer John and say, yes, God has become man and is now coming back to declare his kingdom with power. He doesn't tell John that. He uses evidence. He uses the physical stories of what's going to happen, and that's what we're going to look at this morning. And so chapters 8 and 9 have been designed by Matthew to play that foundational role in building up Jesus as the Messiah. There's only a few places in Matthew where it directly says that Jesus is the Messiah. But let's look at one real quick. Chapter 1 and verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. If you read that in several other translations, it doesn't say Jesus Christ. It says the Messiah. Jesus the Messiah. The book of the generations of Jesus the Messiah, the son of Abraham, the son of David. And of course, we're going to see that title, Son of David, used this morning in this morning's lesson. But before we get there, let's look at the outline of what we're going to look at this morning. So we have, let me restart my timer here so I don't get too long-winded. Jesus is now showing here in chapters 8 and 9, instead of just telling like he did in 5 and 6 and 7, Jesus is now showing and demonstrating what it means to have authority as the Son of Man. And it's sort of like it's ramping up. At first we have people that are being healed. And these are very visible things. The one who was leprous, when he was touched and healed and cleansed, it would have been visible to everyone around him. These things are not done, not hidden. Although they weren't necessarily made a spectacle of, they weren't hidden. And so Jesus is demonstrating what it means to have authority as the Son of Man. So the last few weeks we've been seeing Jesus giving the kingdom announcement, right? That the God of Israel, the creator and the redeemer of Israel, is taking back the world and from what we've done to the place, right? He's setting things right in Jesus. So we had this idea and we had this vision of what Matthew's presented to us of a teacher Jesus. And he's about transforming the heart, right? Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are these people. And we had teacher Jesus. And we had compassionate Jesus last week, right? Who's healing these people. And we had surprising Jesus last week, especially too, who includes the Gentiles in the Messianic feast, the one that was designed for Israel. Right? Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are at the table, and Jesus is inviting in the people from the east and the west, the Gentiles. Last week, so here, that's slow build up. Now we got Jesus last week showing his authority over the sea and calming the chaos of the waters. And especially in light of the Hebrew Scriptures, that can only mean one thing. It's something that only the God of Israel can do. So there's a slow building progression of revelation of Jesus' authority that the disciples are understanding. They see these things and they're trying to put them together. And so now this week we have the ultimate meaning of Jesus' authority here on earth. Right? The reason that he came. The purpose he came for. The purpose he came for was forgiving our sins and restoring us to God via himself. And so now we have Jesus, not as a teacher, not as a compassionate Jesus. We have Jesus as an authority figure in this story, this first story here in chapter 9, especially of the paralytic man. This is not necessarily heartwarming Jesus, right? I don't think of authority figures in our life and think of heartwarming all the time, right? Especially as Americans, right? We have freedom. Don't tread on me. These authority figures don't usually sit too well with us. I should get to do what I want to do. It's a free country. So let's look at the first part of the narrative here in chapter 9 and see where Jesus is going. And I think we need to not make any mistakes here. And we need to know that this story is not in Matthew's gospel to show that Jesus is just another powerful teacher or speaker. For Jesus to forgive sin in a first century context is a loaded and symbolic act. There was a very clear place where Israelites went to have their sins forgiven, and it wasn't some random house in a village somewhere in Galilee, right? It was the temple in Jerusalem. It wasn't a carpenter's son that they had doing it at the temple. It was a Levitical priest. And so Jesus is not acting powerful. Let me start over. Jesus is not just acting powerfully in this story, but he's redefining people's concepts of who God is and what he looks like. And he does that so much so that these Hebrew Bible teachers think that Jesus is blaspheming. And so this story's purpose here, the first story here of Jesus healing the paralytic, its purpose is to establish Jesus as a supreme authority figure. And let me just digress for a little bit, because we need to talk about what an authority figure is, right? We've all experienced authority differently in our own lives, right? Some of us were more rebellious than others, and so we might have had more run-ins with authority, whether they're security guards or the police, or maybe it's our boss at work or our parents. We all know that one person who has their will and their purpose, and they're going to impose that on you from a distance. You know, they're not physically touching you or moving your hand to make you do something, but they give a threat of some sort of punishment if you don't comply with their will. And most of us have had some really negative experiences like this in our own life. So when we read the story, we find something different, though. Sometimes we read the story and we think, oh, authority figure Jesus, that's not my type of guy. The difference, though, is that the problem is that we fill in the meaning of the word authority based on our experiences with the mall security cop guy, the rent-a-cop that thought we were stealing. And so that's who we fill in the authority figure, and we put Jesus in that role, that he's the guy with the big stick hovering over you, just waiting for you to mess up. That's not who Jesus is. That's exactly backwards of who Jesus is. What it means to be a Christian is to come to these narratives and to let them redefine everything for us. And when we insert our own feelings and our own negative experiences into the scriptures, we will have a distorted view of who Jesus is and why he came. Jesus didn't come to hold a big stick just waiting for you to mess up. Jesus is the revelation of who God is. He is Emmanuel, chapter 1 and verse 23, right? He came to save his people from their sins, chapter 1 and verse 21. He is God with us. And so, let's get back to the story here. Do we all remember the story? Everybody remembers the story, right? Of the friends who hack through the neighbor's roof and lower the guy in. That's this story. Matthew doesn't give us any of those details, of course. Matthew is very to the point. And so when you read something in Matthew, there's probably a theological significance tied in there with it. And it's probably half of the words that Mark used or that Luke uses to describe the same event. Matthew is just not giving us details. He's giving us relevant details, though. So, verse 2. Let's look at verse 2 of chapter 9. Let me ask a question so that we think about it while we're reading it. What does Jesus notice about the situation? And getting into the boat, he crossed over and came to his own city. That would be Capernaum, because when you get into a boat and you cross over Galilee, that's the city that's on the other side of the north end of the lake. Chapter 4 and verse 13 says that he also settled there. So he probably had some sort of a house, or maybe he rented a room from somebody, or, however it went, he had a place to stay there in Capernaum. And behold, some people brought to him a paralytic laying on a bed. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Take heart, my son, your sins are forgiven." And behold, some of the scribes said to themselves, "This man is blaspheming." Let's just look at verse 2 real quick. What does Jesus notice? He sees the friend's faith is what he sees first. And so what I want to point out here is that faith, if he sees the friend's faith, he sees an action that they're doing. You see, faith is not a set of beliefs that is inside of your heart. That is a common misconception in the broader world of Christianity today. Faith is not a set of internal beliefs. I promise you. Look up faith in any of the scriptures, and it is 100% always accompanied by an action. And so faith is seen. Faith is the beliefs in our hearts coming out into action in our lives. And so in this case, it's the mindset that these 5 men had, his 4 friends and the man, that there's something wrong with me, and Jesus can do something for me that I cannot do for myself. I have to get in front of Jesus. I have to get to Jesus. That is the faith they have. They didn't have faith in Jesus Christ as the God become man who is going to save us from our sins. That's not in their realm of ballpark of thinking at all. Their faith was based off of Jesus doing something for them that they couldn't do for themselves. And so our faith needs to be based on something that Jesus can do for us that I cannot do for myself. And that is anti-American. Let me tell you straight up. As Americans, we want to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. We want to go and get it done ourselves. But I'm here to tell you that there's some things that you can't do for yourself. You cannot heal yourself spiritually. And so Jesus doesn't look at their words. He doesn't ask them for a confession of faith. He doesn't ask for what they thought about him. He doesn't ask for what they believed about him. He looks at their actions. And so if you want to know what you believe in your own life, don't ask yourself what you believe, because that might depend on how much coffee you had this morning, right? If you want to know what you believe, look at how your life is playing out. Look at how you are living your life, and not compared to someone else, like, oh, I'm better than these guys sitting in jail over there. I guess I'm doing okay. I'm not in jail. No, but in comparison to the authority, in comparison to Christ. So this is the community that surrounds, these type of people are the community that surrounds this paralyzed man. This type of community that surrounds this man saves this man through their faith. It doesn't say the paralyzed man's faith saved him, does it? This is a powerful image for us today. When we look at the members of faith in our own community for help and for structure, there's not much of another way to say it, but I'm here to tell you this morning that you need other disciples in your life. You need people, because there will be a time when your faith is paralyzed, and you will need other people to carry you. You need people in your life. You need a community of faith. So, that is the main part of the story. I want to back up and look at some of the more abstract concepts, though. What does Jesus do with this authority? He has now claimed he has the authority. He has now proved he has the authority. What kind of authority does Jesus have, right? I'm sure the man was, happy to have his sins forgiven, but can you put yourself in this man's place? Jesus, what about my legs? What about my legs? Right? Jesus has the authority to point out and to deal with the deepest brokenness of sin, the deepest brokenness of failures of the human heart and the human mind in our relationships with each other. And so what does Jesus do with his authority? He moves towards hurting and broken people. This is very different than the security guard who moves towards hurting and broken people, right? With the stick to make sure they get out of here. How does this man know he's forgiven? When we think of it in terms of first century Judaism or Israel and how they had their sins forgiven, Forgiveness was always a public matter. You had to go to the temple to sacrifice, which means, in the case of Galilee, you had to hop on your donkey and carry lammy underneath your arm for 70 miles. Or you could buy one there if you had the money. You had to go up, you had to wait your turn in line because there's probably 100 people in front of you who stole their neighbor's donkey also. And you go in, you finally get into the inner courtyard area, and the curtain opens up, and there's a guy standing there dripping in blood who says, "Come in." Because he's already slaughtered, he's already sacrificed hundreds of animals today. And you go in, and this priest who's covered in blood meets you, and you confess your sin, and he slits the animal's throat, and he pours the blood into a bowl. These are visceral things that are happening. This is a visceral experience, and it's designed to remind us of the seriousness of the pain that we have caused others and that we have caused to God. So can you see the scandal now when Jesus, from the tribe of Judah, pronounces the same thing that only priests could pronounce? Where's Jesus? There's a whole lamb, temple thing. What happened? I gave this example in Bible class this morning, but if my two neighbors are arguing because their dogs are pooping in each other's yards, I can't just walk into the middle of the conversation and say, "Don't worry, you're forgiven." That makes no sense for me to walk into the conversation they're having and just pronounce forgiveness. That is what happened here. Jesus walks into this man's life, or this man walks into his life, and he just pronounces forgiveness. Jesus walks in and he stands between this man and God and says, everything's now right between you and him. He doesn't offer a sacrifice. He doesn't do everything that the law says to do. Jesus is offering God's forgiveness as his own forgiveness. He is playing the God role. And instead of diffusing the situation, he just cranks that dial a little bit higher, just like calming the storm. He cranks it. We're probably already at 10 with calming the storm. Now he's trying to twist the knob up to 11. And so he rubs it in even harder. And he says, "For which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise and walk?" Any kook on the corner with a bullhorn today could go and pronounce that sins were forgiven. It's easy to say that. But to demonstrate his authority, Jesus uses his authority to create a new man out of an old man. And so he says, rise up. He says the more difficult thing. Rise up as proof of his ability to heal. So then the last question is, do you view Jesus as the security guard? Are you threatened by Jesus' authority? When Jesus tells you to do something, do you see him as the angry security guard, or do you see him as the loving God who wants what's best for you? Are you threatened or are you healed by Jesus' authority? Are you sitting there mad at God for all the things that you can't do in the world? Because people who are threatened by Jesus' authority are more interested in preserving their own actions than putting themselves in front of the living God and allowing him to transform their lives. And so the authority of Jesus liberates people. People with faith are healed and liberated by giving themselves up and allowing God's perfect purpose to free them from their sin and from the weight of the world. So that's the first lesson there that Matthew gives us in chapter 9, the first 8 verses. Let's keep going. We're going to run through the rest of this chapter pretty quick-like, because it is I was looking at all my commentaries. Chapter 9 has got to be one of the least commented on chapters in Matthew because it's like a duplicate of chapter 8. And who wants to just obloviate and just keep talking about the same things that just happened in chapter 8? I want to point out some special things, though, that are going on here. But we will skip over some stuff. Like here on the slide, we have the fasting and the old wineskins and new wineskins. We're not going to talk about all of the meaning in those things because we're going to get to talking about those things again in chapters 10, 11, and 12. So I want to save those for then. But let's talk about Jesus when he calls Matthew. And so let's get back into where we were. He's just healed and liberated this man who was paralyzed. Jesus is going to turn around and heal and liberate another man, Matthew, and this time it's someone that everybody hates, the tax man. No offense, Sam. And so the wording of verse 10 here, let's look at verse 10. And it happened that as he was reclining at the table in the house, it doesn't say whose house it was. Actually, it very well grammatically in the Greek could be the house that Jesus was staying in. So Jesus could have had this tax collector in his own house. I've had Sam over. Behold, many tax gatherers and sinners came and were dining with Jesus and his disciples. After Jesus calls Matthew, he just says, follow me. There's two words there. Follow me, really simple. Matthew gives a sort of banquet, but the Pharisees are upset because Jesus is associating with sinners. And I mentioned this in the class that first century Jewish writings, and even prior to that a little bit, had a generic category for unobservant Jews, and it could be that maybe you stole something and you hadn't made an offering for it yet, and you were putting it off, that type of person who is not really interested in worshiping God and truth and justice. That could be a sinner, or it could be somebody overt, like a prostitute, who's flouting the rules there in front of everybody. But they had a special category for tax collectors. And as a host, Matthew, the tax collector, has undoubtedly invited these people in because they're the people that he knows with. He's the people who he associates with. And they're ungodly. His friends are ungodly, and they're sitting and they're mingling with Jesus, the Messiah, the Lord, and his disciples. And didn't Jesus know these social customs that he was violating? Well, of course he did. But he'd already learned the lesson. Those disciples had already learned the lesson that was about to be taught to the Pharisees who were outside, because they wouldn't have gone inside that house with the tax collectors and sinners. Jesus is going to demonstrate to them the transforming power of the gospel. That he is able to take a despised tax collector and turn him into a beloved apostle. Jesus is able to appeal to these social outcasts and provide love and hope and a new life and create in them a new person who is clean. Whether that's healing physically or whether that's a spiritual cleanliness. And so there's loads of meaning that come on these next two stories about fasting and where am I at? I am on verses 18. No, that's the healing Matthew called. Here we go. Verse 12. When the Pharisees come and they ask him these questions There's loads of meaning in his answers here, but I want to save them for next week and the week after and the week after that. The next 3-4 weeks, we're going to be going over chapter 10, 11, and 12. We'll probably spend 2 lessons on chapter 12, and we're really going to look at Jesus' conflict that starts coming to a head in chapter 12. And then we're going to come back and look at the new wineskins here. Let me just read it. It says, "And the disciples of John came to him, saying, 'Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?'" The fasting was one of the traditions of the elders. It was not in the Torah. "And Jesus said to them, 'The attendants of the bridegroom cannot mourn as the bridegroom is with them, can they? But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and they will fast. And no one puts a patch on an unshrunk cloth.'" "For the patch pulls away from the garment, and worse tear results. Nor do men put new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wineskins burst, and the wine pours out, and the wineskins are ruined. But they put new wine into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved." We're going to talk about what that means in the next coming weeks, but let me just give you the short version right now. Jesus is giving explanations to John's disciples, and especially in the next 2 weeks, John's disciples are going to come and question him again and ask him who he is. Are you the one we're looking for, or should we look for another? For now, let's just remember that these answers are Christological, and that is a fancy word for meaning pertaining to who Christ is. It describes Christ. And so they tell us the amazing and startling different character of what Jesus is bringing, the kingdom of heaven, right? It's astounding to them. They say, "What kind of man is this?" as soon as he calms the sea in chapter 8 and verse 27. And then chapter 9 and verse 8, after he heals the paralytic man, it says, "When the multitude saw this, they were afraid." Some versions say there. They were filled with awe. They marveled. And then they worshiped God. And so let's look at the third group of healings here. So we've had the basic outline of chapters 8 and 9 is that we have three healings. We have this short section of teachings on discipleship, when we have 2 people who are coming to him wanting to be disciples. One is a scribe. He says, "I want to be a disciple, Lord." And Jesus says, "The birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man doesn't even have a place to lay his head." And so the idea here is that this person is not ready to become a disciple. It's not overtly said that he does or does not become a disciple, but the implication is that he doesn't become a disciple. The other point is that this man is coming to Jesus wanting to be a disciple. Here in Matthew, when he comes to walking along and he sees Matthew, he comes to Matthew and he calls Matthew. And so these 2 stories are designed to complement each other in opposite ways. The scribe is also somebody who is a part of the establishment, and Matthew is just the opposite, somebody who is not part of the establishment. So we have 3 healings, interlude. Then we have the stories from last week, the ocean. The third healing in that second group is the paralytic. Then we have another interlude. And now we have the last group of 3 healings, which is actually 4 because one of them happens on the way. But ruler, in this case, when they come across the ruler in verse 18, he is really just a local leader. Because even if he was the chief person in the synagogue, that wouldn't have put him at a very high social rank. I mean, he would have been one of the main guys, but this is not a prestigious position like governor or president or something like that we think of today. And he's on the way to heal this man's daughter, and an unclean woman who has been continually menstruating for many years and was therefore unclean. This woman comes up behind Jesus, hiding from him. And notice it doesn't say that she wants to be healed. Most English versions will say, "If only I touch his garment, I will get well." This is an acceptable translation of this word. I'm not going to say that I know better than the translators. But for the most part, this word, do we know what this word is translated as? Does anybody have any markings in their Bible? A note? Mine has, and I'm kind of grateful that it does, because it made me go back and look at the Greek. That I might be saved. That I might be saved. She says it other times, and there's other times the word is used here. The woman wanted to be saved. Matthew wants us to connect the dots between forgiveness of sins, healing, and being saved. For when Jesus, turning, said to her, "Daughter, take courage. Your faith has made you well." That's the same word that's used for saved. Again, Jesus says, "You're saved." And at once the woman was saved, made well. And so, wholeness in our life, being saved, can only come through that face-to-face confrontation with Jesus and his saving power. And it's going to repeat itself. That pattern is going to repeat itself in the next few stories. In the next healing, we see the blind man, and they explicitly call Jesus the Son of David. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. But Son of David is only applied to the physical first-generation sons of David in the Old Testament, Absalom, Solomon, and that's it. The only other person it's applied to is Jesus. And why is that important? Because unlike the Son of Man, that had a sort of ambiguous meaning, because Ezekiel applied it to himself, Son of David had a very explicit meaning, especially during this time period in the first century. They were declaring that Jesus was the one from the line of David who would come and gather Israel up into a new nation. This Messiah figure that they called the Son of David was expected to restore sight to the blind. That was Isaiah 35. And so, I mentioned this in the class this morning. Chapter 1 and verse 1 of Matthew. The book of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Christ, the Son of David, the son of Abraham. And so this final group of miracles, this final group of three miracles here, is really a preparation for the fact that there is a great harvest out in the world. There's a great harvest, and there's these crowds, and it needs laborers. It needs people to take care of them. It needs people to heal their brokenness. It's also going to give rise to controversy, right? And we're going to see a lot more of that starting in chapter 12 when he faces the Pharisees. And we see a preview of that in verse 34. But the Pharisees were saying he casts out the demons by the ruler of the demons. We're going to see in chapter 12 that he contradicts that. But as we move into those last few verses here of the chapter, we see that Jesus was going through all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. This is sort of a transitional paragraph here, and it's both a summary of the words of Jesus from chapters 5 through 7, and it's a summary of the works that he's shown in chapters 8 and 9, and it's an introduction of what's going to happen in chapters 10 when he sends out the 12 in their mission to the world. And so this forms a framework because this is a direct quotation from what he's written earlier in chapter 4 and verse 23. This creates a structure, a narrative structure, a framework around these collection of words and deeds that Matthew has put together for us of Jesus. And we can see how they fit together and they teach the disciples the nature of who Jesus is and what his authority is. And so Jesus is going to entrust this message to these 12 people, and he's going to explain it further in chapter 11 and verse 27. Let me read it real quick. He's going to explain his power and his authority even more when he says, "All things have been handed over to me by my Father." That is an unequivocal statement. Nothing that has been not handed over to him. Everything has been handed over to him. And no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son. And anyone whom the Son wills to reveal him. Jesus is going to use this sheep and shepherd image to show us that God is revealing to us himself, right? Emmanuel, God with us. He's revealing himself in these actions, in these healings, in the forgiveness of sins, in the calming of the waters, things that only God can do. Jesus is revealing God to us. And so the sheep-shepherd image that's so frequent in the Old Testament, we talked about it in class, it's Ezekiel 34 all over again. It's the primary relationship between God and his people in the Old Testament. The primary way it's portrayed. But it also points to their need for human leadership, right? That's why he sends out the disciples. Because in the metaphor in Ezekiel, the chief shepherd hires other shepherds to guide the sheep. And so Matthew's already used this metaphor already in chapter 2, right? In verse... let me look it up. Chapter 2 and verse 6. "And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, by no means least among the nations, least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." So Matthew's already used this idea of a shepherd coming out to shepherd the people of Israel. And he's going to pick it up again in the mission to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. All right, that's next week. That's Matthew chapter 10 in verse 6. "Rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And again, in the most obvious place, he's going to pick it up again in the parable of the good shepherd in Matthew chapter 18. And so let's tie up all this chapter here with this question. This is the same question from chapter 8 in verse 27. What kind of man is this? What kind of man is this? Who am I in the boat with when they see the calming of the seas? When they see this paralyzed man have his sins forgiven on the spot? Something that, we go to the temple because that's the meeting place between God and heaven, right? The first response is fear. What kind of human is this? But if what just happened, whether it's the calming of the sea or the forgiveness of sin, if what just happened If Jesus is who he says he is, oh man, that's a big realization to make. And you can see the gears are grinding in their head. They're beginning to move. They're beginning to understand these things. Jesus didn't come to say the temple was bad, right? He didn't come to say that the Torah or that the law and the prophets are bad. He's saying that those things were pointing forward to a fulfillment in himself. But how? How was that going to happen? This is the reason that the first story here in the chapter is so important, and the reason I spent half the lesson on it. It's because the temple was the meeting place between God and humanity. It was the meeting place of heaven and earth. It was the place where God's holiness and his grace and human sin interacted. And they were all in the temple. It's the place where God committed to forgiving sin and to transforming people. And Jesus just kind of says, that's my role now. I'm just going to insert myself right into the middle of this equation. Like me running to my neighbors who are having the argument and saying, there's no more argument. All's forgiven. To them, it doesn't make any sense when I roll up and do that, right? Jesus just inserts himself into the middle of the equation and says he is the new temple. He is the new priest who's going to offer forgiveness. He is the God who is offering forgiveness to people. He just declares it. And so first, the people are very justified in feeling fear. But the implications of that are astounding. And it's right to be filled with fear because the implications of who Jesus is and his authority. But their fear is converted into worship because Jesus is not the security guard. Jesus is God's loving authority who has come in the form of a man to create in them a new life in a loving relationship with God. And if you need to declare Jesus as that role in your life, if you need to put yourself before Jesus and say, I cannot take care of my own sin, if you haven't done that, you need to this morning. You need to come and put yourself in front of Jesus and say, I need you, Lord. I repent of my sins. I am ready to put you and your lifestyle on in baptism, to clothe yourself with Christ. And if you're ready to do that, we can do that for you this morning. If you need anything, whether it's the prayers of the congregation or whether you need the waters of baptism, please let us know and we can help you with those things. But take care of it today. And that's the lesson for this morning for chapter 9. Next week we'll be looking at chapter 10. It's good to have everybody here this morning.